The words hit Deputy Roy Calloway like a fist to the jaw. "Cancel everything on my schedule. I have someone more important to see today." Roy stood in the doorway of the Redemption Creek Sheriff's office, his hat in both hands, turning it slowly as he stared at his boss. James Atkins, the boldest lawman to ever pin a star to his chest in the whole of Colorado Territory, was already pulling on his good jacket. Not his work jacket with the worn elbows and the smoke stain on the left cuff. His good one. The dark brown one he only wore to church and to funerals, and from the look burning in those steel-gray eyes, this was neither. "Sheriff," Roy started carefully, "you got the Delancey hearing at noon. Judge Harmon rode in special from Denver for it. You got the Border Patrol meeting at 2, and at 4, the town council wants to talk about the fire damage on Miller Street." James did not turn around. He was looking at himself in the small square of mirror nailed to the wall beside the gun rack, and he was pressing his collar flat with the flat of his palm like a man who had not checked his own reflection in years and was surprised to find he still had one. "I said cancel it, Roy." James. Roy almost never used his first name. Almost. "This is the Delancey case. We have been building this case for 11 months. 11 months of watching that man run stolen cattle across the border and bribe half the county officials in the territory. And Judge Harmon is sitting in a courtroom 200 yards from where you are standing right now waiting for you to testify." James finally turned, and Roy saw something in the man's face that he had not seen in the 4 years he had served under him. Not fear. James Atkins did not do fear, not in any conventional sense. This was something rawer than fear. Something that had no clean name in the vocabulary of men who wore badges and slept with loaded rifles beside their beds. It was the face of a man who had just discovered that something he thought was dead was still alive, and that the discovery had rearranged every priority he had ever held. "I know what day it is, Roy," James said quietly. "I know exactly what day it is and what is at stake with Delancey. But Della Merriweather just rode into town, and she is sitting in the Widow Prentice's kitchen right now, and she has not eaten since yesterday morning, and she has a bruise on the left side of her face the size of my hand." The name landed between them like a dropped lantern. Roy opened his mouth, closed it. "She is back," he said. "She is back," James confirmed. He picked up his hat, settled it on his head, and walked past Roy toward the door. "Send word to Judge Harmon that I will have a written affidavit filed by nightfall. My testimony can be read into the record. Delancey is not going anywhere. The evidence is airtight." He paused in the doorframe, and the morning light of a hard September sun in 1878 cut him into shadow and brightness at once. "But Della might be gone again by noon if I don't get there first." He walked out into the street, and Roy Calloway stood there alone in the office holding his hat and thinking that in 4 years he had watched James Atkins face down armed outlaws, survive a prairie fire, and negotiate with a Ute war party without breaking a sweat. He had never once seen the man look shaken. He looked shaken now, and not by danger, by something far more terrifying than danger. He looked like a man walking toward the one thing in the world that had the power to unmake him entirely. To understand why Della Merriweather's name could do that to a man like James Atkins, you had to go back 3 years. You had to go back to the summer of 1875, to a town that was barely a town yet, to a woman who arrived on a stagecoach with a leather trunk, a sharp tongue, and a secret that would take years to fully surface. Redemption Creek had been little more than a trading post and a collection of ambitions when the Colorado Pacific Rail Survey brought a wave of speculators and settlers through the valley. James Atkins had been the appointed sheriff for 8 months at that point, sent by the territorial governor after the previous sheriff, a man named Boggs, had been found to be more outlaw than lawman. James was 28 years old, serious and deliberate in the way that men become when they have seen too much too young, with a past he kept folded up tight and never spread out for public inspection. Della Merriweather arrived in July of 1875, 24 years old, and she came to take up a position as the town's first schoolteacher. She had trained at a women's college in Ohio, and she carried herself with a kind of precise dignity that some of the rougher elements of Redemption Creek initially mistook for arrogance. She had dark brown hair that she wore pinned up severely during school hours, and that she let down in the evenings when she thought no one was watching, and she had green eyes that shifted toward amber in certain light, and that had a habit of seeing more than most people wanted to be seen. James met her on her third day in town, when she came to the sheriff's office to report that someone had stolen 2 boxes of school books from the storeroom beside the church where she had been temporarily housed. He had been at his desk writing reports when she walked in, and he had looked up expecting another minor complaint about claim jumping or cattle disputes, and instead found himself looking at someone who had the immediate effect on him of making the room feel different, as though the air had changed density. She was not soft. That was the first thing he noticed. Not in the way people used that word about women, meaning yielding. She had a quality of precision to her, like a good instrument. She knew exactly where she stood, and she stated what she needed without apology and without performance. "I need to report a theft," she said. 2 crates of McGuffey readers and 1 crate of arithmetic primers, taken sometime between Tuesday evening and Wednesday morning from the storeroom at the First Baptist Church. The lock was not broken, which suggests either a key was used or the door was not properly secured from the inside, which was my error. I am reporting it regardless because public property belonging to the school district should be documented. He had stood up because that was what you did, and he had introduced himself, and she had shaken his hand with a grip that meant business, and that was how it started. Or rather, that was how the beginning of it started. The real beginning was slower and stranger and more layered than a single handshake. He found her books. It took him 4 days. 2 boys, 13 and 14 years old, sons of a man named Garrett who ran a gambling house on the south end of town, had taken them on a dare and hidden them in a creekside cave east of town. He returned them personally, loaded in the back of the town's supply wagon, and Della had met him at the schoolhouse door and looked at him for a long moment before saying, with what he would eventually come to recognize as her version of warmth, "I was not sure you would bother." "Why not?" he asked. "School books are not cattle," she said. "I understand which things in this territory people consider important and which they consider ornamental." "Books are not ornamental," he said. She looked at him again in that measuring way. "No," she agreed. "They are not." After that they had conversations, occasional and unplanned, in the way of 2 people in a small town who keep finding themselves in the same spaces. He attended the school's first public reading evening, because the mayor asked him to be present for security reasons, and he spent the whole evening listening to children recite passages from history texts, and found himself thinking that the woman directing them from the front of the room had constructed something real out of very little, which was not an easy thing to do in any arena. He started going to the reading evenings voluntarily. She noticed, but said nothing about it for a long time. What she did eventually say, one October evening in 1875 when the last of the parents had gone home and she was banking the small iron stove and he was still sitting in one of the children's chairs looking ridiculous and not caring, was this: "You are a complicated man, Sheriff Atkins." "James," he said, "please." "James," she repeated as though testing the weight of it. "You are a complicated man." "I am a fairly simple man," he said. "Simple wants, simple work." "You recited the last 4 lines of the Gettysburg Address along with Marcus Holt tonight," she said. "Under your breath, but I heard you. Simple men do not memorize Lincoln." He was quiet for a moment. "Then my mother used to read it to me when I was young." Something shifted in her expression, not pity, which he would have hated, something more careful than pity, recognition maybe. "Mine read me Emily Dickinson," she said, which was considered wildly inappropriate for a girl in rural Indiana, but she did it anyway. "She sounds like she was brave," he said. "She was," Della said quietly. "She died when I was 16. He did not say he was sorry in the empty way people said it. He just nodded once, the way you nodded at something true that did not need dressing up. That was the real beginning. Through the winter of 1875 and into the spring of 1876, something grew between them that neither of them named directly, because naming it would have required a kind of courage that is different from the courage either of them had needed before. It was not that they were cowards. It was that both of them had dark pasts that they kept carefully behind them, and moving toward something new meant briefly turning your back on what was behind you, and neither of them had yet decided that was safe. James's dark past had a name: Cole Ritter. Cole was James's younger brother by 3 years, a man who had gone wrong in a specific and devastating way. Cole had ridden with a gang operating out of New Mexico territory in the early 1870s, a crew known for bank robbery and worse. James had spent 2 years tracking him, not to arrest him, but to try to reach him before someone else did. He had not succeeded. Cole had died in a standoff in Las Cruces in the spring of 1873, and James had been 2 hours too late, and the particular shape of that failure had carved channels in him that were still open and raw even now, even 3 years later in a new town with a new life. It was a secret he carried because in those years, lawmen with outlaw brothers were not trusted. The connection, however unearned, had the power to end a career and close a community's door. He had not lied about it precisely. He had simply not spoken of it in ways that invited questions. Della's secret was different in nature but equally weighted. She had been engaged before Ohio, before the teaching certificate, before any of this. She had been engaged to a man named Gerald Harwood, from a respectable family in Cincinnati, and Gerald Harwood had been, behind the closed doors of his respectability, a man who believed that what belonged to him could be treated however he chose. She had not spoken of this either, had not even fully named it to herself in those years, because 1875 was not a time or a place where there was language for what she had survived that did not also require her to explain why she had not left sooner, and she was exhausted by explanations that placed the burden on her. What she had done, practically, was leave. She had taken her teaching certificate and her leather trunk and the money her father had left her, and she had gone as far west as opportunity would take her, which turned out to be a not yet finished town in Colorado territory called Redemption Creek, which had the advantage of being both real and very far from Cincinnati. The trap of the past was that it had a tendency to find you even when you ran far enough. In March of 1876, a man arrived in Redemption Creek. He came in on the Wednesday stage, and he checked into the hotel, and on Thursday morning he walked into the sheriff's office and introduced himself to James as a private inquiry agent hired by the Harwood family to locate a young woman who had, in the family's considered opinion, left Cincinnati under circumstances that required legal scrutiny. His name was Price. He had small eyes and a careful way of saying things that never quite committed to a direct accusation but always implied one. The family has an interest in certain personal property that Miss Merriweather may have taken with her when she departed, Price told James, sitting in the chair across from the sheriff's desk with his hat on his knee. What property? James asked. Letters, Price said. Personal correspondence of a sensitive nature. James looked at him for a long moment. He had a sheriff's instinct for the difference between a legitimate claim and a dressed-up threat, and this was a dressed-up threat wearing the coat of a legitimate claim. Has a formal complaint been filed with any court? He asked. The family prefers to resolve this quietly, Price said. Then the family's preference is not my jurisdiction, James said. If you have a legal complaint with supporting documentation filed in a recognized court, you bring it to me and I will review it. Until then, any resident of this town is under my protection, and I will be watching your conduct here very carefully. Price had looked at him with the flat assessment of a man recalculating. Then he had smiled a smile that was not a smile and left. James had gone directly from that meeting to the schoolhouse. Della was in the middle of a geography lesson when she saw him appear in the doorway, and the look on his face made her excuse herself from the classroom, stepping outside into the cold March wind. He told her about Price. He told her plainly, without decoration, because she deserved to be told plainly. She had gone very still in the way she went still when she was thinking hard and fast, and then she had said, "I took nothing that was not mine." The letters he is referring to are letters I wrote, not letters written to me, and they were taken from me, not taken by me. "I believe you," James said. She looked at him sharply. "You do not know the full circumstances." "No," he said, "I do not. But I know the type of claim, and I know the type of man making it, and I know the difference between a legal action and a harassment campaign." He paused. "You do not have to tell me anything you do not want to tell me, but if there is anything I should know to protect you effectively, I am asking you to trust me with it." The word trust sat between them like a lit match. She told him. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. She told him about Gerald Harwood, about the engagement, about what that time had cost her, about the letters she had written to a cousin in Boston describing what her life had actually been like in that house, letters that Gerald had intercepted, and which he now held as leverage because they contained descriptions of things he insisted he could characterize differently in a court of law. James listened without interrupting, which was a form of respect she had not always been given. When she finished, he said, "Price is gone by Friday, or I find a reason to hold him that his employer will find expensive to argue against. And I am going to write to a colleague of mine in the marshal's office who has a long memory for private inquiry agents who work the wrong side of their license. You cannot simply make him disappear," she said. "I am not going to make him disappear," James said. "I am going to make his continued presence here more trouble than it is worth to the Harwood family, which is a different thing. Law has tools, Della. They are just not always the ones people think of first." It was the first time he had used her given name without being invited to. She noticed. She did not correct him. Price left Redemption Creek on Friday just as James had predicted. He did not come back. James never entirely explained what he had communicated to his contacts, and Della never entirely pressed, because some things in this world operated on a kind of informal justice that was the only justice available, and she was pragmatic enough to accept that. What she was not pragmatic enough to do, apparently, was say what was becoming increasingly obvious to both of them. It was Roy Calloway who finally said something, which was either very perceptive or very unwise of him, and Roy himself was never sure which. It was late April of 1876, and he caught James reorganizing the same stack of paperwork for the third time in one afternoon, and he said, "You know, Sheriff, in my experience, when a man has shuffled the same papers 5 times without reading them, it generally means he is thinking about a woman." James had given him a look that could have cured leather. "I am going to pretend you did not say that," James said. "Of course," Roy agreed pleasantly, and went back to his work and let the silence say everything else. The evening in May 1876 when James finally let something cross from unspoken to spoken, it happened the way real things often did. Sideways, unexpectedly, and in the context of something else entirely. They had been walking the length of the main street after the town's first organized spring social, which the mayor had insisted on as a morale exercise, and which had involved fiddle music and a great many people standing around pretending to enjoy themselves while actually conducting business. Della had attended because the school was being formally recognized at the event, and James had attended because the mayor had asked him to, and because, if he was honest, it was where Della would be. They were walking back in the direction of the boarding house where she lived, in the dark and the dust that smelled of sage and warm earth, and he had said something unremarkable about the spring weather, and she had replied with something equally unremarkable, and then they had both stopped talking, and the silence had stretched into the kind of silence that means something. "I want to say something," he said finally, "and I am going to ask you to let me say it all the way through before you respond, because I am not very good at this, and if I am interrupted I will lose the thread." She turned to look at him. The moonlight was generous that night. "All right," she said. He took a breath. I am aware that this town is not an easy place for a woman with your education and your standards. I am aware that I am not an easy man in any of the ways that count. I have a past that I have not fully shared with you and that I am not proud of, and I carry it as carefully as I can, but it is there, and it is real. I am not asking you for anything that would compromise your position or your reputation or your peace. I am asking, simply and directly, whether there is any possibility that you would permit me to call on you properly and formally, which in this context means Sunday afternoons if you are not occupied, and perhaps occasional dinners at the hotel when the proprietor is not serving something terrible, which is not always. She was quiet for long enough that he began to regret the speech. Then she said, "You mentioned your past." "Yes," he said. "I would like you to tell me about it," she said. "Not as a condition, but because I have told you about mine, and I think fairness requires the same from you." He told her about Cole, about the gang, about the 2 years of tracking, about Las Cruces and arriving 2 hours too late, and what 2 hours too late meant in the context of a gunfight. He told her about the choice he had made afterward, to become the thing he had been chasing Cole away from, to wear the badge and mean it, to make the years of following his brother's wrong trail into something that served a different purpose. She listened the way he had listened to her, completely, without interrupting. "You blame yourself," she said when he finished. "I do not know if blame is the right word," he said. "I know I was too late." "Being too late is not the same as being responsible," she said. She said it with the firmness of someone who had been told a version of the same thing about her own history and had fought hard to believe it. "No," he agreed, "but it feels the same sometimes." "Yes," she said quietly, "it does." Sunday afternoons began the following week. They were the best hours James Atkins had known in years. They rode together, when weather permitted, out along the ridge east of town, where the view opened up into the kind of vastness that made personal trouble feel appropriately proportional to the actual scale of things. They talked the way people talked when they had stopped performing for each other and started simply being present. She had opinions about everything, and they were almost always interesting. And when she was wrong about something, she argued her position with such intelligence that being right felt like less of an achievement than simply listening to her. He fell in love with her in the specific way that people fall in love when they are no longer young enough to mistake excitement for depth. It was a gradual, thorough thing, like water finding its way into stone. And by the summer of 1876, it had reached the point where a day that contained no contact with her had a specific quality of incompleteness that he was done pretending was about something else. He told her he loved her on a Sunday afternoon in August of 1876, standing at the creek that gave the town its name, while the water ran fast and cold from the summer melt and the cottonwoods were in full greenery overhead. She turned to look at him, and she had that expression he had come to know as her real one, the one she wore when she was not managing anything, just feeling it. "I know," she said. "That is not the conventional response," he said. "I know that too," she said. "James, I need to tell you something. Something I have not told you because I was not sure I had the right to say it until I was certain I meant it completely." "All right," he said. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. Then she looked at him, and what was in her face was something that moved through him like heat. "I am in love with you too," she said. "I have been for some time. I did not say it sooner because I wanted to be sure I was saying it as someone who trusts her own judgment and not as someone running toward safety. I needed it to be real and not reflexive." She paused. "It is real." He crossed the distance between them and kissed her for the first time with his hand cupping her face, and the creek running loudly beside them, and the sunlight coming through the cottonwoods in moving pieces. And it was the kind of moment that does not need much description because the feeling was its own entire language. They were happy in the way that people are happy when they have both arrived at happiness via roads that were difficult enough that they understand the value of it. The summer and fall of 1876 were good months. He proposed in November, a quiet evening in the schoolhouse after a reading event. No audience but the last embers in the iron stove, and she said yes without hesitation, which was its own kind of gift from a woman who hesitated about almost nothing accidentally. They planned for a March wedding, which gave the town time to organize itself into the appropriate levels of celebration, which in Redemption Creek meant the congregational minister, the hotel dining room, and approximately half the surrounding territory showing up in their best clothes. And then January came, and with January came the thing that unraveled everything. Gerald Harwood arrived in Redemption Creek himself. Not with Price this time, not with agents or intermediaries. Gerald Harwood came personally, which meant his pride had overtaken his strategy, and in James's experience that kind of pride was the most dangerous kind because it had stopped calculating and started demanding. He was 32, well-dressed, with the kind of face that had been handsome and knew it, and had let that knowledge replace the need to develop anything else. He checked into the hotel on a Tuesday in January of 1877, and by Wednesday he had gone to the schoolhouse. Della told James what happened with the careful control of a woman who was very angry and was not going to let the anger be mistaken for weakness. Gerald had arrived at the school in the middle of the lunch hour, when the children were out in the yard, and he had said things. He had said that she still owed him a formal explanation. He had said that he had spoken to people in Cincinnati who were willing to provide statements about her character. He had said that the Territorial Education Board was an institution that responded to certain kinds of correspondence, and that it would be a shame for a woman who had built something here to watch it dissolve. And then he had said that if she came back to Cincinnati with him, none of that would be necessary, because the matter would be considered settled. James listened to this with his hands very still on his desk and his face completely controlled, which Roy Calloway, watching from across the room, recognized as the most dangerous form James Atkins ever took. "Where is he now?" James asked. "The hotel," Della said. "James, you cannot go there and do anything that will compromise your badge. That is exactly what he would want. He knows how to work within systems. He will file a complaint against you and use it." "I know," James said. "That is not what I am going to do." What he did was go to the hotel and ask Gerald Harwood to come to the sheriff's office voluntarily for a conversation, which Harwood agreed to with the smooth condescension of a man who believed his class, and his money created a particular kind of immunity. In the office, James laid out several things calmly. He explained that making threatening statements to a resident of his jurisdiction, with intent to coerce that person's compliance, constituted a criminal matter under territorial law. He explained that any correspondence sent to the Territorial Education Board with the intention of damaging a teacher's reputation based on personal grievance, rather than documented professional failure, would be tracked and documented, and would be used in any subsequent legal action. He explained that a man who had traveled this distance to personally confront a woman who had left his company was demonstrating a pattern of behavior that judges and territorial officials were increasingly inclined to look at very carefully in this period, and that James had personal relationships with several of those officials. Then he said, very quietly and very clearly, "Miss Merriweather is engaged to be married, to me. She is not going anywhere with you, and she is not doing anything because of threats you make. You are going to leave this town on the Friday stage. If you are still here on Saturday, I will find a reason to hold you that your family's lawyers will find both expensive and embarrassing to fight." Harwood had gone cold and then gone carefully, precisely furious. He said several things about James's background, which James received without expression. He said several things about Della's character, which James received with a stillness that was more controlled than anything he had ever managed with a loaded gun pointed at him. Then Harwood left. He was gone by Friday. James watched the stage himself to be sure. What James did not fully anticipate was what Gerald Harwood did after he left. He wrote the letters anyway, not to the Education Board, because James had made that path look expensive. Instead, he wrote to people in Redemption Creek itself, to members of the town council, to the minister, to certain community figures who prized reputation above almost everything else. The letters were careful. They did not make accusations that could be legally prosecuted. They raised questions, in the way that questions can be raised without being asked directly, about the nature of a woman who had left an engagement under unclear circumstances, about certain matters of character and conduct that remained, the letters implied, unresolved. It was February of 1877 when the effects began to surface. Parents kept children home from school. The minister had a conversation with the mayor, who had a conversation with the school board. The boarding house where Della lived asked her, apologetically but firmly, to find other accommodations. And two council members suggested to James, in separate and carefully worded conversations, that his engagement might be, as they put it, something the community needed more time to understand. The hidden motive behind all of it was the ugliest kind: control by proxy. Gerald Harwood could not force Della to return, so he had attempted to make her position in Redemption Creek untenable. Della handled it for 6 weeks with a composure that James knew was costing her enormously. She found new rooms at the widow Prentice's house. She continued to teach, even with reduced enrollment. She attended church with her head up and her hands steady, and she did not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. But she was flinching inside. James could see it, because he knew her now in the way that only proximity and genuine attention make possible. He could see it in the small tightening around her eyes and the particular way she held her shoulders, and the fact that she laughed less spontaneously and thought more carefully before she spoke, as if she had gone back to managing the impression she made rather than simply being present. In March, she came to him and said the thing he had been dreading. "I need to leave Redemption Creek," she said. They were in the schoolhouse after hours, and the cold light through the small windows made everything look provisional. "Not because I want to. I want you to know that. But I have a sister in Kansas City, and she has offered me a position helping her husband with his accounting business until the climate here settles. If I stay and the enrollment continues to fall, the school board will dismiss me, and a dismissal follows a teacher. A voluntary resignation because of family circumstances follows differently." He had known it was coming. He had been hoping he was wrong. "Della," he said. "Do not ask me to stay," she said, and there was a break in her voice that she controlled immediately and precisely. "Because I want to stay and I love you, and if you ask me to I will stay, and it will cost us both more than it should. Let me go and let me come back when it is possible to come back with dignity intact, because I will not have you looking at me in 5 years, and knowing that what we built was built on the rubble of everything I was forced to give up." He understood what she was saying. He hated it, but he understood it. "I will not stop writing to you," he said. "I am counting on it," she said. She left on the last Wednesday of March, 1877. He stood at the stage and held her hand until the moment she had to board, and she turned once at the top of the step and looked at him with those amber-green eyes, and he thought he had never in his life seen anyone so determined to be all right, and it moved something in him that he did not have clean words for. She wrote. He wrote. The letters moved between Redemption Creek and Kansas City on the mail routes that were themselves sometimes unreliable, and sometimes a letter took 3 weeks to arrive, and sometimes it arrived the same week it was sent, and the irregular rhythm of correspondence was its own particular kind of longing, because you never knew when the next one would come. He worked. He built the Delancey case through 1877, gathered evidence with Roy's help, cultivated witnesses, and tried not to let the absence of her become something he organized his entire life around. In Kansas City, she helped her brother-in-law manage accounts and taught reading to the children of several families in the neighborhood, and wrote her letters to James by lamplight. And she tried not to let the absence of him become a wound she kept reopening every time she thought about it. The letters were love letters in the truest sense, not decorated or performative, but the real kind, where two people describe the actual texture of their days and trust the other person to understand why those details matter. He wrote her about the Delancey case and about a difficult negotiation with a Ute trading party that had come through the territory, and about Roy's inexplicable habit of naming the office's two stray cats after presidents. She wrote him about a book she was reading, and about a woman she had met in Kansas City who was organizing the city's first women's library association, and about a Sunday afternoon thunderstorm that had come off the prairie and turned the whole sky green before it broke. The letters were the connective tissue of something that might otherwise have pulled apart under the strain of distance and time and the general hostile pressure of circumstances. And then in August of 1878, 3 months before James looked at himself in the office mirror and told Roy to cancel everything, Della's letters stopped. He waited 2 weeks, then 3. He wrote twice without response. He contacted her sister's household in Kansas City through a business colleague in Denver who had connections there, and the reply that came back was short and troubling. Miss Merriweather had departed the household in early July. Her whereabouts were not known. Departed, not visiting, not traveling for a specific purpose. Departed with the particular weight that word had when someone left without leaving a forwarding address. James sat with that information for a day, and then put Roy in charge of the office and took the Denver stage to Kansas City himself. He arrived after 4 days of travel and went directly to his colleague's contact, who introduced him to Della's sister, a woman named Margaret who was clearly frightened about something she was being careful not to say directly. He asked her plainly. She told him, after he explained that he was not a stranger to her sister's history and that he had no interest in anything that would compromise Della's safety. Gerald Harwood had come back, not to Redemption Creek this time. He had traced Della to Kansas City, which had required either persistent effort or hired assistance, and he had arrived in June, and he had been making her life very difficult in the specific ways that men with money and no legal impediment could make a woman's life difficult in 1878. He had involved her employer, her landlady, her social connections. He had also, and this was the part that made James's hands tighten to fists, confronted her directly twice, and on the second occasion there had been an altercation that Margaret described with careful vagueness but whose meaning was unmistakable. Della had left Kansas City in early July to remove herself from the situation. She had not told Margaret where she was going because she did not want Margaret to have information that could be extracted from her. James spent 3 days in Kansas City following every lead he could find. He identified the agency Harwood had used to locate Della. He documented the pattern of interference across 2 states and 17 months. He filed a detailed account of the behavior with the Kansas City City Marshal's office, and with a federal circuit court contact he had through the territorial governor's office in Denver. And then he went home to Redemption Creek because he could not find her, and because eventually people came home, and Redemption Creek was the closest thing to home that Della Merriweather had built since she was 16 years old. He came home, and he built the Delancey case to the point where Judge Harmon had agreed to ride in from Denver, and he waited, and he tried not to let the waiting turn him hollow. On the morning of September 14, 1878, Roy Calloway came to the sheriff's office with the news that a woman had arrived on the early stage. Dark hair, green eyes, leather trunk, and a bruise on the left side of her face, which brought the story back around to where it started. James walked to the widow Prentice's house with his heart in his throat and the September sun hot on his shoulders, and he knocked on the front door, and the widow Prentice opened it with the expression of a woman who had been expecting this particular caller. "She is in the kitchen," the widow said. "She would not let me send for the doctor, but I made her eat." "Thank you, Clara," he said. He walked through the house to the kitchen, and Della was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee between her hands and a road tiredness in her whole body that went deeper than physical distance, and she looked up when he came through the door, and whatever she had been holding carefully in place for however long it had been since July, it moved now, visibly, crossing her face like weather. He crossed the kitchen in 5 steps and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands in his, and he looked at the bruise along her cheekbone with a steadiness that cost him something, and he said, "You are here. You are safe now." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "I am sorry I stopped writing." "Do not be sorry," he said. "I did not want him to find you," she said. "I was afraid that if you came after me it would give him something to use, something about you and your badge and his lawyers." "I know," he said. "I figured that out eventually. I went to Kansas City." Her eyes widened slightly. "You went to Kansas City." "Margaret told me enough," he said. "I filed documentation with the marshal and with the circuit court. It will not solve everything immediately, but there is a record now that spans 2 states, and that record matters when it comes to what follows." She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with something in her face that he could not quite read because it was too large for a single word. "He followed me," she said. "I left Kansas City in July because he found me there, and I went to Laramie for 6 weeks and then he found me there too, and then I went east of Pueblo for 3 weeks staying with a farming family I met on the stage, and when I finally decided that running was not going to work, I came back here." She paused. "I came back because I could not think of anywhere else where I was not alone." He brought her hands up and pressed them between both of his and held them there. "You are not alone," he said. "You were never alone. I just could not find you." "James," she said, and his name in her voice had the quality it always had, the thing that made it sound like both a statement and a question at once. "I need you to tell me what happened," he said. "The bruise, I need to know." She told him. She had been at a stage stop outside of Pueblo when Harwood had caught up with her. He had hired men to help him track her, private men with no official standing, and he had confronted her in the stage depot with the intention of, in his words, making her see reason. When she had refused to go with him, one of the men with him had grabbed her arm and she had pulled away and struck her face on the edge of a wooden counter. He had not struck her himself, which was the distinction he would draw, but the circumstance of the bruise was his doing and he knew it. She had gotten onto the stage to Redemption Creek while the altercation was still unresolved, and the driver, who was a man named Cobb who had seen enough bad situations to recognize one, had gotten the horses moving before Harwood could effectively intervene. James listened to all of this with the same complete attention he always gave her and with the same tightly controlled steadiness that was, she had long ago recognized, the way he managed things that moved him very deeply. When she finished, he said, "He is going to come here." "I know," she said. "I want to tell you what I have been building for the past several months," he said, "because you deserve to know that this situation has moved significantly from where it was when you left." He told her about the documentation he had filed in Kansas City. He told her about a communication he had sent through his federal circuit contact to a judge in Cincinnati who had been examining complaints about the Harwood family's business practices, a separate matter but one that created a context. He told her that a pattern of behavior documented across multiple states and involving multiple official complaints had a legal weight that single isolated incidents did not carry. "He has no legal hold on you," James said. "He never did, but the harassment is actionable now in a way that it was not 2 years ago because we have 2 years of documented incidents. A federal circuit judge has a copy of everything I compiled." She was looking at him with something that was not quite disbelief but was close to it, the look of someone who had been carrying a weight for so long that being told it can be set down feels like a claim too large to trust. "You did all of that," she said, "while you were here, while I was gone." "You were not gone to me," he said simply. "You were just somewhere I could not reach yet." That was the moment she stopped holding the careful composure she had been maintaining since she walked into the widow Prentice's kitchen, and she put her forehead against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her, and they stayed like that while the morning light moved through the kitchen windows, and the widow Prentice made herself very busy in another part of the house. After a while she straightened up and pressed the heel of her hand to her eyes with a practicality that was very Della, and she said, "The school." "The school is still here," he said. "Enrollment dropped significantly while you were gone. The current teacher, a young man named Briggs, is adequate, but the parents have been asking about you since spring. The board dismissed me," she said. "The board made a politically motivated decision under pressure from community gossip that has since largely dissipated," he said. "Roy has been quietly working on several council members for the past 6 months. There is a meeting scheduled for next week." She looked at him. "Roy has been working on council members." "Roy has a gift for conversation," James said. "I never fully appreciated it until I needed it." The sound she made was almost a laugh, and it was the best sound he had heard in a very long time. Gerald Harwood arrived in Redemption Creek 11 days later. James had been expecting him. He had, in fact, prepared for him with the same methodical patience he brought to everything that mattered, which meant he had sent 3 letters in the days after Della's return, one to the Federal Circuit Court contact, one to the city marshal in Kansas City, and one to a colleague in the Denver Territorial Marshal's office. He had also spoken with Judge Harmon, who had remained in Redemption Creek following the Delancey hearing, which had gone smoothly and resulted in the indictment James had worked 11 months to achieve. Harmon was a pragmatic man who disliked certain kinds of bullying when they were presented to him in properly documented form, and James had presented them in properly documented form. Harwood came into the sheriff's office on a Tuesday morning in October, and he was alone this time, which meant either he had underestimated the situation or he had overestimated his own authority, and in James's experience those two things often came together. Roy was at his desk. James was standing. He had positioned himself standing because sitting across a desk from a man like Harwood was the kind of thing Harwood expected, and preparation was most useful when it was least expected. "I am here for Della Merriweather," Harwood said. He said it the way men said things when they believed their saying of them was sufficient. "Miss Merriweather is a resident of this town," James said pleasantly. "She is not available to be had." "She was my fiancé," Harwood said. "A situation that ended several years ago," James said, "by Miss Merriweather's choice and through legal means. I am sure you are aware that engagement is not a contract of ownership under any law currently operative in this territory or in the state of Ohio. You have been interfering with a private family matter," Harwood said, and his voice had sharpened. "I have been documenting harassment conducted across multiple states," James said. He opened the file on his desk and turned it to face Harwood across the surface of the desk. "This is a summary of incidents involving you or persons in your employ, targeting Miss Merriweather, dating from February of 1877 through September of this year. There are signed affidavits from witnesses in Kansas City and in Laramie. There is a copy of this documentation currently in the possession of Judge Harold Harmon, who is at this moment having breakfast at the hotel 200 yards from this office. There is another copy with the Federal Circuit Court in Denver and a third with the United States Marshal's office." Harwood looked at the document. Something changed in his face. The sharpness became something more careful. "You have no authority over me," he said. "I have not committed a crime within your jurisdiction." "Not within my specific jurisdiction, no," James agreed. "But the pattern of behavior documented here crosses jurisdictions, which is why I have involved federal contacts rather than relying solely on my own authority. Judge Harmon has the discretion to issue a federal restraining order under the current circuit guidelines that would prohibit your approach to Miss Merriweather anywhere within a 500-mile radius." He paused. "He is inclined to do so. I spoke with him yesterday." The silence that followed was the longest kind. Harwood said, in a completely different voice, stripped of the performance, "She cannot simply end it and take nothing with her. She owes me." And James, who had waited for the real statement to surface, said, "She owes you nothing. She built a life out of what you cost her, and that life is hers, and I will spend as long as necessary making that legal reality absolutely clear to every authority with jurisdiction over any place you might encounter her. What she owes you is not your concern from this point forward." He picked up the file and closed it. "I am going to suggest that you go home, Mr. Harwood, not as a threat, as the clearest possible advice. Because the path you are on ends in a federal court, with documentation that will be significantly more damaging to your family name than whatever satisfaction you thought you were going to find here." There was a very long moment. Harwood picked up his hat from where he had placed it on the corner of the desk. He looked at James one more time, and it was the look of a man who was recalculating and finding the numbers did not work in his favor. Then he left. Roy waited until the sound of footsteps had receded from outside before saying, with enormous satisfaction, "That was beautifully done." "Thank you," James said. He sat down at his desk. His hands were, he noticed, completely steady. Judge Harmon issued the federal restraining order 3 days later, before he returned to Denver, and James made sure that Gerald Harwood received his copy in person via the county process server before the Wednesday stage left. Harwood left on the Wednesday stage. He did not come back. In the weeks that followed, something settled in Redemption Creek the way things settled after a long tension released. Gradually, with residual vibration, but fundamentally, irreversibly, in a new and better configuration. Della's meeting with the school board happened on the Thursday of that same week, and Roy had, in fact, done his preparatory work with characteristic thoroughness. 3 of the 5 board members were positively disposed before the meeting began, and Della's presentation of her qualifications, her teaching record, and her vision for expanding the school's curriculum to include basic sciences and geography carried the rest. She was reinstated as the primary teacher of Redemption Creek School, effective the 1st of November. She stood outside the meeting hall afterward in the October dusk, and James was waiting for her on the steps, and she said, "They reinstated me," with a quality of wonder in her voice that suggested she had not fully permitted herself to believe it would happen until it did. "I know," he said. "Roy told me how he thought it would go. I am going to have to say something gracious to Roy," she said, "which is going to require some mental preparation because gracious is not my natural register." "You are very gracious," he said. "I am precise," she corrected. "Those are different things," but she was almost smiling. He asked her to marry him again. Not in a formal way, not with a speech. He asked her one afternoon in the schoolhouse, sitting in 2 adult chairs he had brought in from the hotel and placed facing each other by the window where the afternoon light came through, and he said, "I asked you once before, and you said yes, and then everything went sideways, and I have been thinking that the original question still stands and the original answer still stands. But I want to ask it again in the current circumstances because I want you to say yes to this life. The one that exists right now, not the one from before." She looked at him for a moment, this woman who had been through things that would have reshaped a lesser person into something defensive and closed, and she said, "Yes, to this life, the one right now." They married on a Saturday in December of 1878 in the Congregational Church, with the Reverend Fuller officiating and what felt like the entire territory of Colorado either present or represented. Roy Calloway stood up for James with a dignity that nobody who knew him in his ordinary capacity would have predicted, and the widow Prentice sat in the front row and cried openly and without any apparent embarrassment. The hotel dining room was booked for the celebration, and someone had brought a fiddle and someone else had brought a guitar, and the evening went on longer than anyone had officially planned. James danced, which was something that surprised several people who had assumed his formality extended to all physical expression. He was not a graceful dancer, but he was an engaged one, and Della, who was an excellent dancer, found this entirely charming. "You are terrible at this," she told him, laughing. "I know," he said. "I have always known it has never previously mattered." "Why does it matter now?" she asked. "Because you are watching," he said. She stopped laughing and looked at him with that large, real expression she reserved for moments when he said something that reached past all her considerable defenses, and she said, "James Atkins, you are a deeply romantic man underneath everything." "Do not tell Roy," he said. "Roy already knows," she said. She was correct. Roy knew. Roy had known for years. They moved into a house at the western edge of town, a proper house, not the temporary arrangements they had both been living in since arriving in Redemption Creek. James had been accumulating the materials and the plans for it since the previous spring, and the construction had been completed in November, just in time. It was a frame house with 4 rooms, a covered porch that looked out toward the mountains, and a kitchen large enough to contain the kind of ambitious cooking that Della had decided she intended to learn, having spent too many years in boarding house arrangements to have developed the skill. The kitchen became a project. She approached it with the same systematic determination she brought to curriculum development, acquiring a copy of Mrs. Lincoln's Boston Cook book from the general store, and proceeding through it with methodical ambition. The results were variable at first, but James ate everything she made with the same straightforward appreciation, which she told him was either very kind or very unwise. "Both," he said, finishing a somewhat dense cornbread with genuine contentment. "That is the right answer," she said. The winter of 1878 settled into something James had not had in years and had sometimes stopped believing he would have: ordinary life. The pleasant, daily, unremarkable texture of a life that was shared. Meals that were the same meal every day because it was the meal of 2 people who had chosen this. Mornings with coffee before she went to the school and he went to the office. Evenings that expanded in different directions depending on the day but always came back to the same house, the same porch, the same conversation. It was not without difficulty. He was still a sheriff in a territory that was not yet tame, and there were incidents, disputes. A bad week in February when a cattle dispute between 2 families north of town required delicate negotiation that went on for 3 days and involved one moment of genuine danger that he did not mention to Della until it was fully resolved. She found out anyway, because Roy mentioned it in an unguarded moment, and she spent an evening being carefully furious with James for not telling her, and he spent the evening acknowledging that she was right, and they reached the agreement that she had the right to know what his work actually involved because she was his wife and not a person who needed protection from reality. "I am not asking you to bring me every detail of every difficult situation," she said. "I am asking you to trust me with the significant ones, the ones where you were actually at risk, because my imagination is worse than the truth, and you leaving gaps means my imagination fills them." "That is fair," he said. "It is more than fair," she said. "It is basic consideration." "You are right," he said. "I am sorry." She accepted this with a nod that had the quality of a settlement reached between equals, which was, she had come to understand, the only kind of settlement that would hold between 2 people as stubbornly competent as themselves. In the spring of 1879, Della discovered she was expecting a child. She told James on a Sunday morning, sitting at the kitchen table with the same directness she brought to everything, and his response was to go very still for a moment in the way he went still when something moved him past his habitual composure, and then he crossed the kitchen and held her, just held her, for a long time without saying anything that needed words. When he eventually spoke, he said, "Are you frightened?" "A little," she said honestly. "You?" "Considerably," he said. "Good," she said. "That means we are paying appropriate attention." She continued to teach through the spring term with no interruption to her professional life, because she had made a pragmatic assessment of the school's needs and her own capabilities, and concluded that teaching and expecting a child were not mutually exclusive activities, which was a position that some of the more conservative elements of the community found startling, but which the majority of parents, who had come to rely on her considerably, accepted with the flexible practicality of people whose lives required adaptability. She trained a young woman named Alice Fremont as her assistant through the summer, partly to have help in the classroom, and partly because Della believed that the school's sustainability required more than one competent person at its foundation. Their son was born in October of 1879, delivered by the town's doctor, a capable man named Whitfield who had served as an army surgeon and had the unflappable quality of someone who had seen every kind of difficult situation and had learned that calm was the most useful contribution to any of them. The birth was hard, harder than James had been adequately prepared for, and he spent most of it in the adjacent room reminding himself that the doctor was competent, and that the sounds coming through the wall were not the worst thing and that he needed to remain calm. He did not entirely manage calm, but he managed functional, which Roy, who had come to sit with him through the wait, considered a sufficient achievement. When Whitfield finally opened the door and said, "You have a son," James stood up so fast he knocked his chair into the wall. The baby was red-faced and furious and entirely whole, and Della was exhausted and precise even in exhaustion, and when James sat beside her on the bed and she put the baby in his arms for the first time, she watched his face do something she had not seen it do before, a complete and unguarded openness, like a window thrown wide in a room that had been closed for a long time. "He looks angry," James said. "He has been somewhere very confined for 9 months," Della said. "His feelings are appropriate." They named him Thomas, after no one in particular and after everyone, after the idea of being named simply and solidly into the world you were entering. Thomas was from the beginning an extremely serious baby who observed his surroundings with an intensity that his father recognized and his mother found hilarious. He did not cry frequently, but when he did, it was with total commitment. "He is exactly like you," Della told James. "He is nothing like me," James said, looking at his son with an expression that said clearly that being exactly like him was either the best or worst possible thing. "He looks at everything as though he is taking an official report," Della said. "That is entirely you." James could not entirely dispute this. The years that followed were the years of building, and they were good years with the texture of good years, meaning they contained difficulty and occasional hardship, and the usual unpredictable complications of life in a place that was still being made. But they contained also the bone-deep satisfaction of something chosen and maintained through genuine effort. Roy Calloway, who had been invaluable through more of this story than he would ever take credit for, met a woman of his own in 1880, a widow named Frances Aldrich, who had come to Redemption Creek to visit her brother and had stayed because she liked what she found there. Roy courted her with a diligence and a sincerity that James found both touching and vindicating, because it suggested that Roy's extensive observation of other people's romantic situations had not been purely theoretical. Frances was practical, funny, and kind in the way of people who have learned kindness from experience rather than instruction, and she and Della formed a friendship that was built on mutual respect and a shared appreciation for directness. The four of them ate Sunday dinners together regularly, and these evenings had a quality of ease and warmth that was its own significant thing, the sense of a community that had been chosen rather than simply inherited. James was re-elected sheriff in 1880 with no opposition, which was not a given in Colorado Territory, where elections were enthusiastically contested, and outcomes were not always the ones the most qualified candidates might have expected. But James had built enough of a record and enough of a reputation that the vote went cleanly his way, and the governor sent a letter of commendation that Della framed and hung in the kitchen, because she said that was where the important things in the house belonged. "The kitchen," he asked. "Where we actually live," she said, "not the office." The school grew. By 1881, it had 43 enrolled students and had expanded into a second classroom, which the town built as a deliberate investment after Della wrote a proposal to the council that was so thoroughly reasoned and so clearly documented in terms of community benefit that 3 of the 5 members voted to approve it before the full text had even been circulated. Alice Fremont, now Alice Calloway after her marriage to Roy in a quiet ceremony at the Congregational Church in the spring of 1880, taught the younger children while Della managed the older ones. The school became, more than perhaps anything else in Redemption Creek's history, the thing that marked the town's transition from a collection of ambitions into something that intended to persist. Children who were educated stayed. Parents who saw their children being educated found reasons to invest. The school was the signal that Redemption Creek was building toward a future rather than extracting from a present. Della understood this. She had always understood it. From the first day she stepped off the stage with her leather trunk and her McGuffey readers. She had chosen teaching in the West because she believed that education was not an ornament in difficult places but a foundation, the specific thing that made possibility transmissible across generations. James understood it too, in the way he understood everything she cared about, completely, without needing it to be explained, because he had spent long enough paying genuine attention to her that her passions had become legible to him at a level that went past words. In the winter of 1881, something happened that required James to use every tool his experience and his contacts had given him. A group of men affiliated with a larger criminal network operating out of New Mexico came through the territory with the intention of establishing a protection scheme in the smaller towns along the rail line. They were sophisticated in the way that organized criminal enterprises were sophisticated. They used intimidation calibrated carefully below the threshold of obvious illegality. They cultivated information about local officials, and they moved faster than single jurisdiction law enforcement could generally keep pace with. James identified the scheme in its early stages, partly through information from a Ute trading contact who had seen the men moving through the territory and recognized the pattern, and partly through his own decade of experience with the territory's criminal landscape. He reached out to the territorial marshal's office and to 2 neighboring county sheriffs, coordinating a response that crossed jurisdictions in the way that the threat itself did. The confrontation, when it came, was not a dramatic shootout. It was a legal and logistical operation that resulted in 6 arrests, documented evidence transferred to the federal circuit court, and a report to the governor's office that was used to inform a broader anti-organized crime initiative across the territory. It was unglamorous work, important work, the kind of work that did not make good stories in the newspapers, but that made the ground safer for the people standing on it. James told Della about it over a period of several evenings, the whole arc of it, because they had agreed that she had the right to know his significant professional situations, and she listened with the focused attention she always gave to things that mattered to her. "You coordinated with 3 other jurisdictions," she said, "across county lines. It required 3 weeks of correspondence and 2 personal meetings," he said. "Roy did the first drafts of all the coordination letters because his handwriting is better than mine," she smiled. "Roy's handwriting is legendary." "It is, in fact, very good," James confirmed. "Are you satisfied with how it resolved?" she asked. He thought about it honestly. Satisfied is not quite the word. The men involved were part of a larger organization that still exists. What we accomplished was a local and a territorial disruption. It will matter for a few years. Whether it matters beyond that depends on what happens at the federal level. "That is an honest answer," she said. "I try," he said. "I know," she said. "That is one of the things I love about you." He looked at her across the kitchen table. This woman who had survived Gerald Harwood and the collapse of her first position in Redemption Creek, and 3 months of being hunted across 3 territories, and who had rebuilt everything with a composure and a determination that still moved him the same way it had moved him the first time he saw it. And he thought, with the quiet certainty of someone who had stopped needing to announce things to know they were true, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing, with exactly the person he had been, in ways he had not understood until she arrived, always moving toward. Thomas was 3 years old in October of 1882, and he had resolved from the red-faced fury of his infancy into a child of considerable personality, combining his father's observational intensity with his mother's verbal precision in a combination that was frequently startling in a person of 3 years. He had opinions about everything and communicated them in fully formed sentences that surprised adults who were used to children of his age. He told Mrs. Aldrich yesterday that her bonnet was architecturally interesting, Della reported to James with a straight face. James looked at his son, who was currently examining a horseshoe with the systematic attention of an engineer. "He has your vocabulary," James said. "He has yours," Della said. "I would have said unusual. He said architecturally interesting. That is your kind of precise." "It is a good observation about the bonnet," James said. "It is quite a structure." They were both quiet for a moment, watching Thomas transfer his attention from the horseshoe to a stone and begin a comparative assessment. "Are you happy?" Della asked. Not the question people asked when they were looking for reassurance. The real question, the one that trusted the other person to answer with the same honesty it was asked with. He looked at her. The kitchen was warm, the stove was going. The late afternoon light was coming through the window she had put curtains on because she said the bare window made the room look provisional. And outside the window the Colorado mountains were doing what they always did in late October, which was turning the whole world into something between beauty and warning. "Yes," he said, specifically and genuinely. "You." She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "Yes," she said. "The same." Della discovered she was expecting again in the spring of 1883, and this pregnancy she carried with the comfortable authority of someone who understood the general territory and had made her peace with the uncertain passages of it. She worked through the summer term and arranged a smooth handoff to Alice for the fall, and in November she gave birth to a daughter whom they named Clara, after the widow Prentice, who had been the first person in Redemption Creek to take Della in without question, and who had, the previous year, moved to live with her daughter in Pueblo, leaving behind a gap in the town's social fabric that no one else had quite managed to fill. Clara was, from the beginning, nothing like Thomas in temperament. Where Thomas was systematic and grave, Clara was mercurial and loud, with a laugh that arrived without warning and a temper that passed just as quickly. She was, James thought, like weather, and he meant this as a complete admiration. Thomas, for his part, received his sister with the measured assessment he brought to all new situations, and by the time Clara was 6 months old he had transferred to her the same serious attentive interest he gave to horseshoes and interesting stones, and the patterns of shadow on the floor in the afternoons, which Della interpreted as love and James confirmed was exactly that, in the Thomas idiom. The years made their accumulation. 1884 came and went, and then 1885, and then 1886, with the specific rhythm of lives being built in real time rather than narrated at speed. James was re-elected in 1884 again, and in 1886 the territorial governor, a man named Adams who had been following the Redemption Creek lawman's career with interest, offered him a position in the territorial marshal's service. James considered it for 3 weeks, which was not like him. He told Della about it the evening the letter arrived. She read the letter, set it down, and looked at him without saying anything for a moment. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I genuinely do not know yet," he said, "which is why I am telling you before I have an answer, which is unusual for me." "I know it is unusual," she said. "I also know why you are uncertain, and it is not because you do not understand the opportunity." "Tell me," he said. "Redemption Creek is what you built," she said. "It is your specific work. The marshal's service is larger and less connected to any specific place. You would have more influence over a larger territory and less contact with the ground-level reality of any particular community." She paused. "Some people find that trade worthwhile. It depends on what kind of work satisfies you." He thought about it for a long moment. "The day-to-day of this place," he said, "knowing the people and the patterns, knowing when something is wrong because I know what right looks like here. That is what I am good at. I do not know if I am good at the kind of work the Marshal's Service does." "You coordinated 3 counties against an organized network," she said. "I did," he said, "but I did it from here, from the ground of a specific place." She nodded slowly. "Then tell me what you lose if you say no." "The position," he said, "the broader scope, the career advancement that a man is supposed to want." "Supposed to want," she repeated. He looked at her. "Supposed to want," she said again with emphasis. He wrote to the governor the following week and declined the position with a respectful and carefully worded letter that explained his reasoning in terms of where he believed his capabilities and his long-term value to the territory were best deployed. The governor wrote back with a graciousness that suggested he understood the reasoning even if he had hoped for a different answer. Roy, when informed of the decision, said simply, "I would have missed you." "I was not leaving," James said. "No," Roy said. "But you might have, eventually, and the town would not have been the same." James considered that. "The town is bigger than me," he said. "Yes," Roy said. "But you are part of what made it big enough." This was probably the most Roy Calloway had ever said in a single exchange that did not involve practical logistics, and James received it with the same dignity with which Roy had offered it. In 1887, Redemption Creek incorporated formally as a town under Colorado law, which had achieved statehood in 1876 and was building its institutional infrastructure with the enthusiasm of a young state proving it could manage its own affairs. The incorporation brought a proper town charter, elected aldermen, and the formal establishment of a municipal court that reduced the burden on the county district court for minor civil matters. James was asked to address the incorporation ceremony, which was held on the first Saturday of September at the steps of the new town hall, a proper stone building that had been completed that summer and that had the quality of something intended to last. He stood at the top of the steps with the Colorado mountains behind him and the main street of Redemption Creek spread in front of him, filled with the people who had built this place out of a trading post and a collection of ambitions, and he said what he had been thinking about for some time. "A town is not a building or a charter or a line on a surveyor's map," he said. "A town is the decision to continue, made by people who have reasons to leave and choose to stay. Every person standing in this street today has made that decision, sometimes under conditions that made it difficult. That decision, accumulated over time and renewed daily, is what Redemption Creek actually is. I am honored to have served it." Della was in the crowd, with Thomas standing seriously at her side and Clara on her hip, and when James looked at her from the steps she gave him the small, specific nod that was her version of everything that would have required too many words to say aloud in a public ceremony. And he looked back at her with the same steady fullness that was his version of the same thing. The applause from the crowd was genuine and warm, and Roy Calloway, standing at the edge of the platform, was doing something with his face that he would later describe as a reaction to dust. The summer of 1888 brought a new difficulty, not from outside but from within the community, the way the most enduring difficulties eventually came. A dispute between 2 families over water rights had been building for 2 years, the kind of dispute that in an undeveloped territory could escalate into genuine violence before the institutional structures caught up to it. James had been managing it carefully, but in June the dispute reached a point of crisis when one family diverted the creek flow above the other's land in a way that destroyed the downstream family's wheat crop. He spent 6 weeks on it. He brought in a territorial engineer from Denver to do an official survey of the water flow and the legal history of the land grants. He coordinated with the county court. He talked to both families separately and then together, not as a law enforcement matter but as a mediation, which was a skill he had developed over years and which Della had been quietly instrumental in teaching him. Because She was the one who had pointed out early in their marriage that his habit of presenting conclusions rather than questions was sometimes less effective than it needed to be. The resolution involved a formal water-sharing agreement filed with the county court, a small cash payment from the county's emergency funds to partially offset the crop loss, and the planting of a shared windbreak along the disputed property line that both families would maintain jointly, which was James's own idea, and which he had proposed with the instinct that shared physical labor on a shared boundary had a quality of treaty-making that purely legal documents sometimes lacked. Both families agreed. Both were unsatisfied enough with the compromise that James was fairly confident neither had gotten more than they were entitled to. Roy called it a masterpiece of equitable misery. James considered that the highest possible professional compliment. Thomas, at 9 years old in 1888, was developing into a person with a clear and particular character. He was deeply interested in maps, in the structure of things, in how systems worked, and why they sometimes failed. He had read through most of the books in his mother's schoolroom, and had moved on to requesting specific texts from the Denver bookseller through the mail order service that the general store now facilitated. He read Euclid at 8 years old and told his father that geometry was a language that did not need translation. "Do you want to be an engineer?" James asked him. Thomas thought about this with characteristic seriousness. "I want to understand how places work," he said, "not just how to build them, how they work over time." "That is a different question," James said. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "I'm not sure what profession answers it." "Maybe several professions," James said. "Maybe you will have to make your own." Thomas considered this with the gravity of a 9-year-old encountering a genuinely new idea. "Could you do that?" he asked. "Make your own profession?" "Your mother did," James said. "There was no professional teaching structure here when she arrived. She built it." Thomas looked at his mother with the particular respect of a child encountering a parent as a complete historical person for the first time. "I did not think of it that way," he said. "Most people do not," James said. "That is your mother's particular achievement. She built something that looks now like it was always going to be here." Della, who had been listening to this exchange from across the room with the expression she wore when she was moved by something and was not going to say so directly, said, "You could have told me that more often over the years." "I have thought it every year," James said. "That is not the same as saying it," she said. "No," he agreed. "You are right. I should have said it more." "You are saying it now," she said, with the small smile that was still, after 10 years, the most specific thing he knew. In 1889, Colorado was still a young state finding its institutional footing, and James spent a significant portion of that year working with the county commissioners on developing more systematic protocols for inter-county law enforcement cooperation, the kind of bureaucratic infrastructure work that was neither exciting nor visible, but that made the entire region function better. He wrote reports and attended meetings and drafted proposals, and Della read all of his drafts and marked them up with the same red pencil she used on student essays, and he incorporated her edits with the equanimity of a man who had long ago accepted that she was better at written communication than he was. "You make my argument clearer," he said one evening, looking at a heavily annotated draft. "You make a better argument than you write," she said. "I am just getting the two into alignment." Clara, at 6 years old in 1889, had decided that she wanted to be the first woman sheriff in Colorado, which she announced at Sunday dinner with Roy and Francis and Alice in a way that produced a moment of surprised silence around the table. Roy recovered first. "That is an excellent ambition," he said with complete sincerity. "It is not a common ambition," Francis said carefully. "Neither was teaching school in a territory that didn't have one," Clara said, with the particular precision of a child who had been listening to adult conversation for some time. The adults looked at each other. "She is not wrong," Alice said. James looked at his daughter across the table with an expression that Della recognized as the large, unguarded one, the window-thrown-wide expression. "You can do whatever you decide to do," he told Clara. But I want you to understand that whatever it is, it will require you to be better than people expect, which is not fair but is true." "I know," Clara said, with the confidence of someone who had not yet encountered the specific friction of that truth but had made her peace with its theoretical existence. "That is why I am starting to practice now." "Practice what?" James asked. "Being better than people expect," she said, as though this was obvious. There was no good response to this, so the adults returned to their food, and Roy caught James's eye across the table and communicated, without words, that this was the finest possible outcome of everything that had happened in Redemption Creek in the past 11 years. The decade closed and a new one opened, and 1890 came to Redemption Creek with the specific quality of a place that had become, by increments and through sustained effort, a real and functioning community with history behind it and intention ahead of it. The school had expanded again, with a third classroom and plans for a small lending library that Della had been advocating for 3 years, and that the town council had finally approved as part of the 1890 municipal budget. James turned 43 in the spring of 1890. He was not young anymore in the straightforward sense, though he was still fit in the way of men who spent their working lives moving through physical spaces, and who had never stopped taking their work seriously enough to let the physical capacity required for it atrophy. His hair had gone considerably grayer at the temples, which Della told him made him look distinguished, and he told her he preferred useful to distinguished, and she told him that those two things were not mutually exclusive, which was correct. She was 39, and she was beautiful in the way that people who have lived their lives in genuine engagement with the world become beautiful over time, the beauty that is the external evidence of an interior that has been built rather than simply maintained. She had more lines at the corners of her eyes, and the confidence she had always had deepened into something even more settled and particular, the confidence of a woman who had built something real and knew exactly what it had cost. They sat on the porch one evening in May of 1890, with the mountains lit in the long Colorado dusk and the town making its evening sounds below them, and Della said, "Do you remember what you said, the first time you asked me to walk out with you? On the street after the spring social. I told you I was not a simple man and that I had a dark past," he said. "You said you had simple wants," she said. "I thought about that for a long time afterward. I was not sure if you believed it or if you were just saying something manageable. At the time," he said, "I was not entirely sure myself." "And now," she asked. He looked at the mountains and then at her and thought about the honest answer. "Now I know that I had simple wants all along," he said. "I just had complicated roads to them. The want was always the same, work that matters, a place that is real, someone to come home to who is also going home." She was quiet for a moment. The evening light was doing something extraordinary to the mountains, as it often did, turning them purple and gold and impossible. "Thomas wrote me a letter last week," she said. "From Denver." Thomas had gone to Denver to attend a lecture series at the Colorado School of Mines, which was studying territorial geography and settlement patterns, the exact confluence of interests he had been developing since he was 9 years old. "What did he say?" James asked. "He said he had been thinking about why Redemption Creek worked when a lot of similar towns from the same period did not," she said. "He had a theory about it." "What was the theory?" She smiled. "He said it was because the people who built it were more interested in what could be built than what could be taken." James sat with that for a moment. "He is not wrong," he said. "He almost never is," she said, with the particular warmth of a mother who has watched a child become an adult and found the adult worth knowing. "Takes after his mother," James said. "He has your stubbornness," she said, "and your patience. Those two things together are why he finishes what he starts." James looked at her. "You gave him the vocabulary to understand what he was doing. You gave him the example of how to do it," she said. They were both quiet for a moment, in the way that people who know each other completely can be quiet, with no part of the silence that needed filling. "I have been thinking," Della said after a while, "about something." "Tell me," he said. "The library," she said. "When it opens, I want to name it. I want it to have a name that means something specific to this town." "What name?" he asked. She paused. "I was thinking about my mother," she said. "She read me Dickinson when it was not considered appropriate. She put something real into my hands and trusted me to know what to do with it. She did not live to see what I did with it, and I think about that." "Name it for her," James said. "Margaret Merriweather Reading Room," she said quietly, "if the council approves." "Present it to the council," he said. "I will vote for it." She looked at him. "You are not on the council." "The sheriff attends council meetings as an advisory presence," he said. "I will advise them that it is the right name." She laughed, the real laugh, the spontaneous one, and reached over and took his hand where it rested on the arm of his chair, and he turned his palm up and closed his fingers around hers. The lending library opened in September of 1890 in a room attached to the school, with bookshelves built by Roy Calloway over the summer, with the assistance of Thomas, who had returned from Denver for August, and applied himself to the construction with the systematic enjoyment he brought to any project that had a clear structural logic. The room held 200 volumes at opening, assembled through donations from residents and purchases made possible by the municipal budget allocation, and a small private donation from Francis Calloway, who had recently come into a modest inheritance, and who felt that books were among the better uses to which money could be put. The sign above the door read, "Margaret Merriweather Reading Room, a place for the curious." The second line had been added by Thomas, who had painted the sign himself and had decided without consulting anyone that the dedication needed a qualifier. When Della saw it, she stood in front of it for a long moment. "He added something," James observed. "He added the right thing," she said. Her voice was entirely steady because she was Della Merriweather Atkins, and her voice was almost always steady, but she reached for James's hand without looking at him, and he took it, and they stood there together in front of the door she had spent 5 years working toward, with the October sun on their backs and the sound of children from the schoolroom next door. "She would have loved this," Della said. "Yes," James said. "She would have." Clara, at 7 years old, and a committed reader despite her announced ambitions toward law enforcement, declared the reading room the best thing that had happened in Redemption Creek in her memory, which covered approximately 6 of the town's 15 years of existence, and was therefore a more qualified assessment than she intended. "In my memory," was her phrase, and James noted it with the quiet amusement that his daughter's precision always generated. "In a longer memory," he told her, "it is still among the best things." "What is the best thing?" Clara asked, with the directness of a child who has not yet learned to treat certain questions as rhetorical. James thought about it seriously because Clara's questions deserved serious answers. "Your mother arriving on the stage in 1875 and deciding to stay," he said. "That is the best thing." Clara looked at her mother and then back at her father with the expression of a 7-year-old filing something important in a place where she would find it later. "That was before me," she said. "Yes," he said, "but it led to you. That is how the best things work sometimes. They are the roots of other best things." Della was watching him with an expression he knew, like he knew the mountains, like he knew the creek, like he knew the specific weight of a Tuesday morning with nothing catastrophic in it. "James Atkins," she said, "you are without question the most unexpectedly romantic man I have ever known." "You have mentioned this," he said. "It bears repeating," she said. "It did. It always had." The winter of 1890 settled over Redemption Creek with the generous snowfalls of a Colorado high country year, and the town that had started as a trading post and a collection of ambitions was fully, irrevocably, solidly a town now, with a school and a library and a courthouse and a municipal charter, and a street of businesses and houses that had the look of things intended for the long duration. James made his rounds in the mornings the way he always had, on foot through the length of the main street and the surrounding blocks, the daily inventory of a place. He knew the way you knew a face you had watched change over years, deeply and with attention. The faces that greeted him were the faces of people he had helped through difficult situations, and people he had held accountable for wrong actions, and people he had simply known for 15 years in the accumulation of daily proximity that is the actual substance of community. He was happy with it. The particular, sustainable, deeply grounded happiness of a man whose life had arrived at the alignment between what it was and what he had wanted it to be, with all the imperfection and complication that real life required, and without the insistence that imperfection meant failure. He thought sometimes about Cole. He thought about him with a grief that had gone clean over the years, the way grief does when you have stopped fighting it and let it simply be part of the landscape. Cole would have been 41 this year. James let himself imagine, occasionally, a version of events in which Las Cruces had gone differently, in which 2 hours sooner had been possible, in which there had been a different ending. He let himself imagine it and then released it, because it was not the story that existed, and the story that existed was the one he was in, and the one he was in was a life he had built with his hands and his choices and his love, and it was real, and it was his. Della knew he thought about Cole. She had always known, even before he had talked about it at length, because knowing the interior shape of the person you loved was its own form of fluency. She let him have those thoughts without drawing them out unnecessarily, and when he came back from them she was simply there, with the specific completeness of presence that was what he had needed all along without knowing it. In the spring of 1891, Della discovered she was expecting again, which was news that arrived with the combined surprise and delight of something you had stopped expecting and then been given anyway. She was 40 years old, and she told the news to James with her characteristic directness, and with a quality of wonder underneath the directness that she did not bother concealing. He received it with the same stillness he had brought to the same news the first time, 12 years ago, and then he held her in the kitchen in the morning light with his face in her hair, and she felt his arms tighten around her with the steady, certain pressure of a man holding what matters most. "Are you frightened?" she asked, as she had asked before. "Less than the first time," he said. "Considerably still." "Good," she said. "Appropriate attention." He laughed. The real laugh, which was not frequent but was, when it came, entirely worth waiting for. Their second daughter, named Rose, was born in October of 1891, and she arrived into a household that had become very competent at welcoming new people, with Thomas home from Denver for the occasion, and Clara taking her role as elder sister, with an authority that the baby seemed, from the beginning, to accept. Roy and Frances came to see her on the second day, and Frances held her with the ease of a woman who had delivered 3 of her own children over the past decade, and Roy looked at her with the expression he always wore around small children, a combination of tremendous care and absolute bafflement, as though they were a phenomenon he respected deeply without entirely understanding. "She looks like Della," Roy said. "She has my hairline," James said. "The combination will be extraordinary," Roy said. "Roy," James said. "Yes." "Thank you," James said. "Not for the specific moment, for everything." Roy understood this because they had known each other for 13 years, and Roy Calloway was a man who understood things that were said in spaces between other things. "Thank you," Roy said back. Same register, same meaning. The afternoon light came through the window of the bedroom where Della was resting with Rose, and James sat in the chair beside the bed and watched his wife and his youngest daughter in the specific way of a man who knows he is inside the best moment of his life and has the grace to recognize it as such. Della looked up from the baby and caught him looking at her. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He told her the truth. "That I am exactly where I should be," he said. "Exactly." She reached out her free hand and he took it, and the afternoon moved across the room in its slow daily way, and outside the window the town of Redemption Creek made its familiar sounds, the sounds of a place that was alive and continuing and real. Thomas came home to Redemption Creek in 1893 with a surveying qualification and a position with the Colorado Geological Survey. which allowed him to be based in the territory while conducting the kind of work that answered his specific question about how places worked over time. He married in 1895, a young woman named Helen Marsh from a ranching family in the San Luis Valley, who had the practical intelligence and the easy warmth that made her an immediate and natural part of the household, and who got along with Della in the particular way of two people who respect each other's competence without needing to compete over it. Clara, at 16 in 1899, was already the most formidable student the Redemption Creek School had produced, with a mind for argument and detail that her mother was nurturing carefully, and her father was watching with the same quiet pride he brought to all his children's particular developments. She had not abandoned her ambitions. She had simply expanded their vocabulary. By 16, she was talking about law school, which in 1899 was an ambition for a woman that existed mostly in theory, but theory was where everything began. "You may have to go east," James told her. "I may," she said. "Is that a concern?" "No," he said. "It is an observation. I want you to go where you need to go to do what you intend to do. Your mother left Indiana and came to Colorado Territory in 1875. Distance is not an argument against the right destination." Clara looked at her father with the full attention she brought to things that mattered to her. "You have always told me I could do what I decided to do," she said. "Yes," he said. "I know you meant it," she said. "Not all fathers mean it." "I know," he said. "I meant it." "I know," she said again, and it was the confirmation of something that she had been carrying as a given her entire life, and the fact that it was a given was itself the gift. Rose, at 8 years old in 1899, was a different creature entirely from either of her siblings, less systematic than Thomas, less driven than Clara, more interested in the texture of the immediate world. The way the light changed on the mountains in different seasons, the specific sound the creek made in spring versus autumn, the way different animals moved. She drew constantly, in the margins of her school papers and on the backs of old envelopes, and Della had started giving her proper paper and proper pencils and letting her fill them with whatever her attention landed on. "She is an artist," Della told James. "She is 8, he said. "She is an artist who is 8, Della said. She was right, as she generally was about the children, because she paid the right kind of attention to who they were rather than who she needed them to be. The century turned in January of 1900, and Redemption Creek turned 25 years old, counting from the informal founding in 1875, when the trading post had first organized itself into something with civic intentions. The town held a celebration that lasted 3 days, with speakers and music and an exhibition of historical photographs that a Denver photographer had taken over the years, arranged chronologically so that you could walk through them from the rough-edged beginning to the established present. James and Della stood in front of the photographs for a long time, moving through them slowly. There was a photograph from 1878 that showed the main street from the east, with the sheriff's office clearly visible, and you could see if you knew where to look the front of the boarding house where she had lived before the widow Prentices, and a figure that might have been either of them or anyone, indistinct in the distance. "We were somewhere in that street," she said. "Probably," he said. "It was September of 1878. I would have been on that street." "You were going to the widow Prentice's kitchen," she said. "You had canceled everything on your schedule." He looked at her. "I had," he said. "Roy told me about that," she said. "Not at the time. Later. He told me that you told him to cancel everything and that you went to me directly." "Roy talks too much," James said. "Roy talks exactly the right amount," Della said. "He told me because he wanted me to understand that you made me the priority even when it was professionally difficult. He was not being sentimental. He was making a point." "What was the point?" James asked. She looked at him with those eyes that were still at 49, the thing that made the room feel different when they were directed at him. "That you chose me in the specific, concrete sense of the word," she said. "Not the abstract romantic sense. The actual logistical, professional, decision-making sense." You had a federal case and a judge in from Denver and a full schedule, and you chose to see me first. There was no choice, he said. You had a bruise on your face and you had been gone for months and you needed James, she said gently. He stopped. You chose me, she said. Let it be what it is. He looked at her for a moment and then he said, yes, I chose you. Thank you, she said, for that, for all of it. Della, he said. Yes. Every version of it, he said. Every version of that choice. Every morning and every schedule, and every time I walked out of that office toward wherever you were. Every time. She put her hand in his. There in front of the photographs of the place they had built together with 25 years of choosing it. Outside, the town of Redemption Creek continued its celebration. The music and the voices and the sounds of a place that had become fully and irreversibly real. And inside the photograph exhibition, James Atkins held his wife's hand and felt the specific completeness of a life that had arrived where it was always, underneath everything, trying to go. Thomas and Helen were expecting their second child. Clara had been accepted to read law with a firm in Denver that had a progressive partner willing to supervise a woman candidate, which was a door that required every credential and every argument, and which she had opened through the combination of her mother's precision and her father's patience. Rose was filling notebooks with drawings that had begun to be remarkable in the specific way of natural talent, encountering the right conditions. Roy and Francis's youngest was 14 now and already talking about surveying, which pleased Thomas considerably and amused everyone else. And James and Della stood together in the particular warmth of January celebration and the weight of 25 years of a place they had helped make real, and they were, in the fullest and most grounded sense of the word, home. The mountains outside the window of every room they had ever occupied in Redemption Creek were still doing what mountains did, which was exist in a scale that made personal trouble feel appropriately proportional and personal joy feel appropriately large. And the creek that gave the town its name was still running, fast in spring and slow in autumn and always, always present. They walked home that evening through the lit and celebrating street, and the cold January air carried wood smoke and the distant sound of fiddle music, and the voices of people who had chosen this place and this life, and were marking the fact of their choosing with the genuine warmth of people who understood the value of what they had. At the door of the house at the western edge of town, with the porch light burning and the windows warm from within, James opened the door for her and she stepped through and he followed her into the warmth of it. And the door closed behind them on the cold and the celebration outside, and the house received them the way a house received people who had filled it with real living, with the quiet, solid certainty of something built to last. Tomorrow, Della said, hanging her coat by the door. Tomorrow, he confirmed. School starts the winter term, she said. I know, he said, and Roy and I have a county meeting at 8. Are you going to cancel it? She asked with a small, particular smile. He looked at her. No, he said, I have everything I need to see right here. She looked back at him with those eyes and that smile and the 25 years of choosing and being chosen that lived in both. Yes, she said, we do. And that was true, and it was enough, and it was everything.